こんにちは。ちょっとバタバタした昼食の
You might not have had enough time for lunch, but we would like to resume the afternoon session. And there is a brief announcement I would like to make before we begin. At 1 o'clock, we had a press conference in a nearby room, and maintaining sustainability and climate change. This perspective is needed for across all development. And we heard a keynote speech this morning from Brookings Institution. Pachataria-san was a central person in putting this report together. And this summary is made available in Japanese outside of the hall. Please feel free to take a copy. Delivering on sustainable infrastructure for better development and better climate. So the keynote speech this afternoon is from Climate Action Network International. Ms. Tasneem Essop will take the floor. Climate Action Network International is involved in negotiation related to climate change and makes approaches from an NGO perspective. Ms. Essop, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Let me firstly thank the organizers of this F20 high-level event for inviting me to be a speaker. I am indeed deeply honored. What I'd like to do is to start off by sharing two stories, a tale of two regions, if I can call it that. And these stories emerge from a social partner dialogue process on the just transition that I recently completed in South Africa. The first story that I want to share is about the impacted communities living in a region called the Highveld. It is a region where we have high levels of poverty and inequality, very serious levels of unemployment, especially amongst the youth. This region has the worst air quality in the whole country and a regional economy that is completely dependent on coal. We have our coal mines in that region. We have all of our coal-fired power stations in that region. And of course, we have our big company, Sasol, that deals with coal-to-liquid fuels based in that region. The community tells us that when they apply for jobs in the coal mines, they get turned down because they fail their medical examination. And they fail their medical examination because they are suffering from respiratory problems. And these respiratory problems have been caused by the coal mines. That is an injustice right there. The communities tell us that then they seek out alternatives to employment, to create their own livelihoods, and they attempt to do this through agriculture, small-scale agriculture. But the land is toxic, and the water is polluted. And so they experience another form of injustice. Their relationship with the workers working in the coal mines is one of antagonism and tension, because the workers working in the coal mines believe that the communities who are impacted on by the coal mines and are objecting to this are actually wanting to take their jobs. And right now, this region is going to face a massive transition because our big monopoly in the country is looking to decommissioning coal-fired power stations. This is the impacted community of a coal-dependent region. The second story I want to share is about the loss of 40,000 farm worker jobs in an area, in a region called the Free State in South Africa. And these jobs were lost because of the droughts that we are experiencing in South Africa right now. This job loss did not make big news in our country. There was no huge outcry. And that is because farm worker jobs in our country are most vulnerable. They are usually seasonal, and also these farm workers are not really unionized. I share these two stories because I think it illustrates very well the challenges that we will face when planning for a just transition. The one story is a transition that must take place for us to reduce our emissions, while the other is a story of the losses that we also endure due to the impacts of climate change. So the concept of a just transition, we know, was hard fought for by the labor movement in the world. After many years of struggling to get the concept acknowledged and accepted, they finally managed to get it into the preamble of the Paris Agreement, and we now know that the concept is gaining traction across the world. Many governments are already looking at planning for just transitions. And while there is no doubt that the transitions are already happening, especially as we've heard this morning in the energy and land and transportation sectors, our challenge now is how to ensure that these transitions are indeed just. How do we ensure that we leave no one behind? This is where the need for coordinated and integrated action and implementation of both Agenda 2030 and the Paris Agreement becomes critical. Nothing has brought all of this into sharp focus than the recent release of the IPCC 1.5 degrees report. I think that that report should be a wake-up call for all of us. The report, of course, calls for rapid and far-reaching transitions. And it says, pathways limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees would require rapid and far-reaching transitions in energy, land, urban, and infrastructure, including transport and buildings and industrial systems. These systems transitions are unprecedented in terms of scale, but not necessarily in terms of speed, and imply deep reductions in all sectors, a wide portfolio of mitigation options, and a significant upscaling of investments in those options. So, the critical challenge is for us to understand that we need far-reaching systems transitions. But that report goes further, and it must be emphasized that the report does not only deal with what is needed in terms of climate action to stay within the 1.5 degree limit, but it also, for the first time, in a most clear and robust fashion, deals with the linkages between climate change and sustainable development. This, however, has not been emphasized strongly enough, and it is good that an F20 high-level engagement such as this would highlight those connections more robustly. The report makes it very clear that avoided climate change impacts on sustainable development, the eradication of poverty, and reducing inequalities would be greater if global warming were limited to 1.5 rather than 2 degrees. That is a very clear statement, and in order to ensure a key element of a just transition, and that being the eradication of poverty and inequality, is taken seriously, it is going to be incumbent on us to make the call for a 1.5 degree limitation a very serious clarion call for all governments to take action. It goes further. It says that poverty and disadvantages are expected to increase in some populations as global warming increases. So limiting, again, global warming to 1.5 could reduce the number of people both exposed to climate-related risks and susceptible to poverty by up to several hundred millions by 2050. So making the connection between addressing climate change and eradicating poverty becomes clearer in this very important IPCC report. In a recent report, an update by the World Bank on their poverty report, it says that while poverty rates have declined in all regions, progress has been uneven. 2 regions, East Asia and Pacific, we have 47 million people living in extreme poverty. And Europe and Central Asia, 7 million. And these are reductions of extreme poverty to below 3%, achieving the 2030 target. However, more than half of the extreme poor live in sub-Saharan Africa. In fact, the report says, the number of poor in the region increased by 9 million, with 413 million people living on less than $1.90 a day. More than all the other regions combined. If the trend continues by 2030, nearly 9 out of 10 extreme poor will be in sub-Saharan Africa. They go on to state that the majority of the global poor live in rural areas, are poorly educated, employed in the agricultural sector, and are under 18 years of age. This is a very important conclusion, however, that while there has been movements in terms of the reduction of poverty, the World Bank report goes on to say that for those who have been able to move out of poverty, progress is often temporary. Economic shocks, food security, and climate change threaten to rob them of their hard-won gains and force them back into poverty. And so it will be critical to find ways to tackle these issues as we make progress to 2030. Now, when we start unpacking the concept of a just transition, the important element of justice within that transition would have to put addressing poverty and inequality in our world at the center of planning for those transitions. And the IPCC report also, for the first time, actually draws very strong conclusions about what is essentially the climate justice elements in terms of the 1.5 degree report. So the report goes on to talk about social justice and equity being core aspects of climate resilient development pathways, and that they have to address the inevitable trade-offs widen the opportunities to be able to address poverty and inequality between and within countries. They talk about the redistributive policies. This is a scientific report that for the first time starts addressing far more deeply and clearly how we ensure climate justice as we are needing to transition quite rapidly in terms of our systems. Redistributive policies across sectors and populations that shield the poor and vulnerable can resolve trade-offs for a range of our sustainable development goals, particularly hunger, poverty, and energy access. Now, the just transition, while the concept has gained traction, and as I said, many governments, many think tanks, foundations, civil society organizations, and especially the International Trade Union movement is doing work in this area. But when we're planning for a just transition, there are a few observations that I would like to share. Firstly, planning for a just transition is not merely a technical exercise. We will not be able to achieve a just transition if we had a number of experts sitting in a room and planning these pathways that we assume is necessary to achieve a new economy and sustainable development. Planning for a just transition is complex and deeply political. It is about power, and it is about vested interests. So the process of planning for a just transition is as important as the outcome. It has to be inclusive. It has to have all those affected at the table when the hard decisions need to be made. It has to be a transparent process. And when we have to make difficult decisions about the trade-offs that we would need to make in this systems transition, we have to ensure that the kinds of criteria we use to make those trade-off decisions are transparent and have been equally shared and negotiated by all affected. The institutional arrangements and the governance framework for dealing with a just transition is equally important. Again, a process like this needs collaboration, social partner engagement. It needs coordinated action. And while governments would need to lead in the planning for the just transition, we need all our critical social partners involved in the institutions that will plan for a just transition, implement a just transition, and make the key decisions for a just transition. And most importantly, and it is the subject of this high-level dialogue session, we need to talk about the financing of a just transition. Who would bear the costs to ensure that our transitions are indeed just? And the issue of equity becomes important in that discussion as well. Equity within countries, but equity between countries at a global level as well. The transition costs are going to be high, and when we talk about shifting the trillions for a just transition, lots of that trillions would of course have to be used for building the kinds of economy and the infrastructure needed for that new economy. However, lots of the trillions would also be used or should be used to ensure justice. And the key elements of justice here and building resilience would be to address poverty and inequality in our world. In that way, ensuring that the links between what we are committing to in terms of climate action and what we have committed to in terms of the SDG, the 2030 agenda, are brought together in a far more connected and coordinated way. We cannot talk about a just transition without ensuring justice. And so, when we talk about leaving no one behind, clearly the IPCC report makes it extremely clear that those who are most vulnerable, those who are poor, those who are disadvantaged, would have to be our focus for attention in building resilience, but also in ensuring justice. Thank you.
Tasnim, thank you very much. ザフ様ありがとうございました。それでは続き。
Thank you very much. Moving on to Dr. Sven Teske, Research Director, University of Technology, Sydney.
スベンテスケ博士は数十年
Dr. Teske, for a number of decades, he has issued various reports, and he's currently at the University of Technology, Sydney.
For having me, and it's a pleasure to speak here. I have the great privilege to present our latest research financed by the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. This is a research project of the University of Technology, Sydney, in cooperation with the German Aerospace Centre, DLR, and the University of Melbourne. The book has been launched in February this year, and I would like to quickly run through the main results. I would like to start with a little sort of science fiction. In 2018, in September 11 actually, that image has been taken, 3 hurricanes were on its way to the North American continent. I was so sort of touched by that image that I decided to use that also as our cover image for the book, because I think that has never been seen before, or rarely seen before, and therefore I have a little fantasy. The fantasy is that now, September 11, 2050, the world successfully decarbonized its energy system and implement a sustainable circular economy. Politicians, financial institutes, and industry now understand that to fight climate change is not a green issue. It's a matter of survival. So how do we do this process in decarbonizing? This is a picture or a graph which shows basically different measures. The black curve going down is sort of the emission for energy-related CO2 emissions. But this is not enough, because we also need negative emissions in form of sinks. And we thought we are going interdisciplinary and looking for ways to find carbon sinks on a natural basis. So we have not used any carbon sequestration technologies, but we have used forests, mainly. So we start to protect forests, we stop deforestation and start reforestation. And that was very important. Also, one of the very important messages here for me is saving the climate, implementing the very important Paris Agreement is not about having a renewable energy revolution. It's not about energy efficiency revolution. It's not about a revolution in terms of nature conservation for natural habitats. It's a revolution of all of these elements together. And there are no low-hanging fruits. We simply have no time for low-hanging fruits. We have to harvest all the fruits we have. And therefore, that was a very interesting and inspiring research to actually put everything together and have an interdisciplinary dialogue of what we actually can do and can't do. So the global trends in the energy sector, we have heard that this morning, so I skipped that. The project scope is very important to know before I present some assumptions and results. First, we develop a 100% renewable energy scenario. We decarbonize the global entire energy system within one generation, 2050 or 2045 maybe, based on technology you have currently available. We used as a reference case the 10 world region scenario based from the IEA World Energy Outlook, the current policy scenarios, because that has been in the past, in the last decades, the most quoted scenario ever, and it's probably one of the most important when it comes to political decision. We model all sectors, power, building, industry, and transport. And we do, with the power sector, an analysis on a regional basis. We basically have broken down the 10 regions into 72 sub-regions to model with regional solar and wind data and the load curves, the storage demand and dispatch demand. And we also add a non-energy related greenhouse gas emission scenarios for CFCs as well as for land use. And then we evaluate all the pathways in regard to their implicit use of the carbon budget and their exceeding probabilities of 1.5 and 2 degrees. And I have to say, the first meeting we had, we sit together with all these institutes. We have 17 scientists, and then we realize that's a pretty tough thing, and how can we do that? And then at the first place, you actually tend to push sort of, you organize sort of this carbon budget, you organize that carbon budget, and you tend to push a little away your problems to the other sector. But that does work here in a complete system. So it was really interesting to see how we come up with a solution across all sectors. This is just a little picture of showing how many models we actually used. First, we got a carbon budget from the University of Melbourne. So, okay, this is the carbon budget you have for 1.5 and 2 degrees Celsius cumulative until 2050 and 2100, and just run with it. That's your budget. You don't have more. Then we modeled the very detailed transport scenario with various different technologies, electric mobility and aviation, shipping, everything. And it's very important to highlight that we can only model on a global level pathways for technologies. What we cannot do is actually do mobility concepts for a global level. Mobility concepts always need to take into account the actual situation on the ground. But what we can model is basically what kind of technologies we use. And very important for me, as one of the first messages, electric mobility is not just about an electric vehicle or electric car. It's public transport, it's light rail, it's electric bikes, it's electric rickshaws. It's a huge range of different mobility concepts. So we have this transport. Then we have the energy system model, where we model everything in 5-year steps. Then we have the resource model, where we map the entire world and looked with all the land users, how much space do we actually have in order to install utility scale wind and solar. And then we modeled the whole system in 1-hour steps for 72 regions. This, for example, shows all the blue areas, and that would be Africa, obviously, would be suitable for large-scale utility wind farms. Solar would look pretty much the same. But then we have to subtract from there what are actually the areas which are fairly close to the grid, because you can't just build a wind farm in the middle of nowhere and there's no grid. Then we have 3 scenarios. We have a 5-degree scenario, that's the current energy, the current policy energy, world energy outlook. We have the 2-degree scenario with a budget of 590 gigatons between 2015 and 2050. And we have a 1.5 degree scenario, which is global energy-related emissions with 450 gigatons. So those are seen in different graphs I show you. And I think the 1.5 degree scenario is a technical benchmark scenario, at least for renewables. If I take EMRO's efficiency pathway into account, we still have some slack with our efficiency. That's the good news. Just for the assumption of transport model, on the 5 degree scenario, we see that aviation and cars go through the roof in the next 30 years. While our scenario is 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees, passenger train and light rail, so electric mobility on public transport, go through the roof. That's a substantial change, and that's a substantial requirement for new infrastructure. And building rails is not trivial, and therefore that's a very important thing in further research. How do we actually can do this and implement that? Results, the global renewable energy potential, we have published that very detailed in the book. The good news is we have absolutely no lack on renewable energy potential, even if we take all the constraints in terms of land use change into account. So we don't need to cover the world with solar panels, and we still can do it. However, there are regional differences, and we are currently working in the last steps to have a 100% renewable energy scenario for Bangladesh, and there are some countries where there is a lack of renewable energy resources regional, and we need to also think about exchanging those renewable energy resources. Efficiency, the energy intensity goes down significantly in all scenarios, but in our 1.5 degree scenario even more. And again, I think EMRO would basically say that's a piece of cake, we can do more. So that's on the positive side, we have been maybe a bit conservative on the efficiency side. In terms of the final energy sector, a demand by sector, the transport sector, which is the dark blue in the bottom, goes down significantly, and that's due to electric mobility, which is a combination of electric vehicles and public transport. The industry goes down a little bit, not too much, and the residential sector goes down significantly because of all the efficiency potentials for heating, cooling, and the electrical appliance. The final electricity demand goes up significantly because we go into a high electrification mode for almost everything, from heat to transport, but also we do have quite a bit of thermal energy left, renewable energy left for process heat and for other heating purposes, because we simply believe that we can't electrify everything at the same time, because we also need to make sure that we don't run into the problem we electrify and then we run out of renewable energy, because the implementation of, for example, electric mobility needs to go hand in hand with the implementation of renewables. Otherwise, we end up powering the electric cars with coal or with gas, which is not what we want. In terms of the electricity capacity, we do have a lot of solar photovoltaic and onshore wind, but also offshore wind comes into account, and offshore wind in some regions is even a backbone. There are some regions which are very good for that, especially if floating offshore wind comes into account and opens up new corridors. So this is this requires, and you won't be able to read all the numbers, but what you will see is, if you take a look at the book, we need to scale up an annual market from around 100 gigawatts solar PV to 400 to 500 gigawatts PV per year installed within the next 4 or 5 years, and maintain that market. We have, usually we have a different approach in terms of the comparison of what is sort of the most economic pathway. Because we actually look at the lifetime, and we look at how much fossil fuels the fossil fuel savings or fuel cost savings can be gained, and we compare that with the additional investment. And we came here to the conclusion that the fuel cost savings can more or less refinance the additional investments. And even though we have not taken into account, because that's on a global level almost impossible, all the infrastructural changes, the annual cost for those global scenarios is $1.7 trillion a year, which is, by accident maybe, or interestingly, the global market volumes for weapons. So the money is there. If I compare that with the 5.x trillion subsidies, fossil fuel subsidies, then we see that we have actually quite a bit of slack to implement that. In terms of transport, efficiency plus electric mobility, we do have also synfuels and biofuels to a very, very low extent. Biofuels only for aviation and for some forms of shipping, but not for cars. Finally, the primary energy demand goes down, or basically plateaus and then goes down on a global level. That's very different from region to region. Obviously, developing countries, I don't have time to show the developing country pathway, goes up while the OECD regions go down. And in some, the overall energy demand peaks around 2025 and then slowly goes down. We have a scenario for bunker fuel supply, and that's very important. So we have the bunker fuels are the fuels for international transport, like aviation, like shipping. We identified 3 regions to produce bunker fuels. That is the Middle East, that's North Africa, and that's Australia, which all 3 have large regions with large potential of solar and wind, and infrastructure for gas exports. So our vision is that we reuse the infrastructure of gas to produce renewable gas and hydrogen and export that for bunker fuels and other fuel purposes, also for industrial purposes. In terms of CO2, we are able to meet the targets, even though I have to say we had a few iterative processes where we said we can't meet that. And we went back to the University of Melbourne and said, could we get a few gigatons more? And they say no. So we actually had to look into more and more options, and then efficiency is a very important part. Again, my message is energy efficiency is as important as renewables. And I simply don't want to have the situation that if somebody asks me what's more important, energy efficiency and renewables, I refuse to answer that question. It's both at the same time. The global power structure, I have to skip that and need to finish with the global power structure. We have, because we have a very high share of variable renewables, solar and wind, and they are not fluctuating, because sunset and sunrise never comes as a surprise. So we know that. We have good forecast mechanisms to actually see that. But we have less and less hours per year where we need so-called baseload power plants. So we will have a complete different structure of power plants, and the solar and wind dictate basically the mix, and then we have a cascade of dispatchable power, load demand side management, and storage. The load per region is very different, but it has one thing. Africa sticks out. Africa will quadruple the load in the grid, so that means there's a huge requirement for infrastructure as well. But the load basically goes up everywhere in all regions, even with energy efficiency, because we have a high electric mobility fleet, and that means if you increase electric mobility or switch to electric mobility, you usually double the electricity demand of a country. To conclude, I skipped that. What we need to do is we have to have not just a good pathway for renewables and for energy efficiency, we also have to have a pathway to phase out fossil fuels. We have heard that from the previous speaker, And what we actually have is we have a specific coordinated action in terms of what we agree on decarbonizing. And the 2-degree scenario would roughly require a decrease of 2% per year, while that 1.5-degree scenario would lead to a 3% decrease of fossil fuel extraction every year. And that means the just transition could be organized sort of like 10 years ahead of time in order to organize the social measures. Because what I see and what I witnessed in the past is that the workers have been sometimes used by their own industry to defend their profits. So that the workers were basically squashed in between the political fight, and that's unfair and unequal. Go back to that model. We see that we have to have a variety of different actions in order to implement the 1.5-degree target. What we have done also for this study, and I don't have time to present, we calculate the metal requirements for cobalt and silver and other metals, and also the employment effect, even on the level of what kind of skills can be actually reused from fossil fuels towards renewables. So to conclude, I think we have absolutely no other chance than implementing an energy efficiency and renewables revolution, plus a revolution in terms of nature conservation, to use our forests and reforest our forests in order to achieve the climate target. And if someone asks me, isn't it too late to achieve the target? I say, no, it's never too late. It's just what we have to do for the next generation. And if we start now and we don't end up with 1.5 degrees scenario, but with 1.5 degrees, but with 1.7 degrees, that's much better than saying, oh, it's too late anyway, just proceed business as usual. And therefore, F20 for me has a very important role to play, because this has been financed by the Leonardo DiCaprio Foundation. That's a foundation research. And we as scientific research institutes are partly dependent on those research money in order to come up with those solutions. And in that regard, I would like to thank you for having a chance to speak to you. And if you are interested in the book, this is for free download. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will go on to the panel discussion of session 2. Thank you very much for waiting as we rearrange the stage.
Yes, thank you. No, not yet. You can come. Because I will introduce you.
Okay.
Right. And I just wanted to show the climate change, actually.
Thank you very much for waiting. Our moderator. Status of the G20 Energy Transition Regulatory Frameworks. Mr. Stefan Schuring, Secretary General of F20, will moderate.
Thank you very much, Mika. And again, thank you to Sven for this great presentation. It really is so important to not just dream of an energy revolution or an energy transition or so, but to indeed look into the numbers. And we've heard a number of those who have really looked into the numbers, from Emery and now this in particular, which was sort of a glimpse into, I would say, the engine room of the energy transition. And the positive news is really this can actually work. And I think we have another excellent panel ahead of us. Just one little story that I wanted to share. When I went to a kindergarten 15 years ago to pick up my niece, I saw a board of images drawn by kids about a house and a chimney and some windows. And what was striking to me, and it illustrates well progress of the energy transition in my own country, in Germany, when I now pick up my own kids in the kindergarten and I see again the drawings of the kids of a house and a window and wind turbines in the background. And some, depending on the perspective, even have solar panels on the rooftops. So still the chimney is there somehow, but I think this really suggests that progress has been made. And this is what we're going to discuss on this panel. And I'd like to invite, first of all, Anna Leitreiter to join us. Anna Leitreiter is the Director, Climate Energy of the World Future Council. I also like to invite Nobu Tanaka, Chairman of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation and the former Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. Please join me on stage. Thirdly, I'd like to invite Mr. Teruyuki Ono, who is the Executive Director of our partner this year of the Renewable Energy Institute. I'd like to invite the Director of the Bonn International Renewable Energy Agency Center, Mr. Dolph Gillen. Please join us on stage. And last but not least, I'd like to invite Hank Rogers, who is the founder and the board chair of the Blue Planet Foundation, who has made the impossible possible in convincing your own government in Hawaii to really embark on a journey towards 100% renewable energy. So we've heard today already this great potential of renewable energy. We've heard that it's technically possible. And I'd like to take a closer look on where we are at the moment, what we are expecting from the G20, and what kind of regulatory frameworks do we need or do we probably don't need to really unleash this development of the energy transition. And I'd like to, without further ado, Anna, give you the floor. Anna, you have been working for some 10 years now professionally in the global energy transition. You've been really looking to the political mechanisms, and both of us have been always looking to the question of political will. Yes, we need the political will, but how do we generate or probably regenerate the political will? Please share a few insights from your work.
Thank you very much. Indeed, we have heard, and probably my intervention kind of builds on the two keynotes that we just heard. Tasmin's point on involving everyone and being inclusive, and Sven's great work on we need the science. That's probably the answer to the question that you just posed. How do we get political will? I came to the conclusion, we've worked for many years on building the political will, and Stefan and me used to do jokes about that. I came to the conclusion, what we actually need is political action. I grew up with a family background of telling me where there is a will, there is always a way. You can always make it happen if you really want to do it. Well, Paris was the big moment where, well, there were many other moments, but Paris was the big moment where we all realized, wow, there is political will in the room. There is, even on the UN level, there are leaders that commit to 1.5 degrees. What else do we need? So coming back from the COP in Paris, I got all excited because finally we can do it. And many years later, actually just 4 years later, we realized, well, there was will, and probably there's still, but there's no action. So how do we make it happen? And what do we need for real action? And I'm not talking about the Trumps of this world. You know, this is really bad enough that we have leaders like Donald Trump. But isn't it as bad as a Trump that we have leaders who commit to certain agreements that signal political will in their speeches, but still don't act? So this is probably one of the key questions. How do we turn this will into action? And I came to the conclusion that for that, we need new voices, we need other people, and I'm not talking only about the young people on the streets in my home country, Germany, and across Europe, and actually across the world. Of course, we need them, but we need many more, because policymaking in the past have been really an elite group. And as many people said this morning on the stage already, it has been a work in silos. So what we actually need is a common approach, a coordinated effort across different sectors of society. Secondly, what we actually need is a policy science interface. So what does that mean? It means that we need policy making based on scientific facts. Otherwise, the theory that we've heard this morning from the scientists is great to hear, but what does it help us in real life? So what we actually need are players, our organizations, our people who can translate the different languages, and I'm not talking about English and Japanese. So how do we make that translation? How do we make that interface? And thirdly, actually, what we do need for political action is to elevate the lighthouses that are happening around the world. Many of you work in great efforts, what we call best practices. A lot of you have been involved in really hopeful initiatives where at the end of the day, we all hope to really see that happening, a big rollout. But how do we make it happen? So the organization that I work for, the World Future Council, is trying to do this, is trying to bring in new voices, is trying to connect the science and the policy, and is trying to leverage best practices and actually translate that into policy frameworks and develop an institutional framework. We do that mostly on the national level, but also on the subnational level, because especially in the climate and energy field, talking about new voices, cities and municipalities are actually the ones leading. So here in the G20 context, probably if you ask me the question, who is the leader in the G20 on climate and energy, I would have a hard time answering that, because
so who is the leader?
So the G20 national governments are probably none of them is really leading. However, looking at the subnational level, looking at all the cities in these G20 countries, they are pioneering the movement. And I can name you hundreds of cities. In my own country, Germany, more than 140 regions and municipalities and cities have committed and actually are doing the transition to 100% renewable energy. Vancouver is a city in a G20 country that has probably the most ambitious climate action plan, is actually implementing it already on a city level. So we do see a lot of hopeful signs also there, but what we actually need is the leverage and the platform. And for that, and that's probably my concluding point, for that we need foundations. We need actually the philanthropic sector, because, and Sven, you were mentioning that at the end of your speech, if we actually want to influence political agendas, if we actually want political agenda setting, which is the end of the day, the way to increase political action, then we need independent money to make that happen. That's not government money who's making that happen. It's not the private sector that's making that happening. It's actually the philanthropic sector who help us to really build the pressure that we need to build for political action. And we don't have the time for that. And the philanthropic sector is probably the only one who can help us. So let's build the momentum together. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you very much. At least I should say, to give justice to those countries who have embarked on the energy transition. Among the G20 countries, it should be mentioned that there's a huge difference between those who don't act. One country you have been mentioning by the president, by the current president, but there are also other countries who are actually really going behind the energy transition. I'm not mentioning any here at the moment, but this is clearly the case for a number of countries, also at the G20. But clearly, we can speed up development. Mr. Tanaka, you've been working in this field for a number of decades, I should say, 2-3 decades maybe. So you're so experienced. You started very early. So you're so experienced in this field, especially as the former executive director of the International Energy Agency. So I'd like to hear a little bit from your perspective, and also from the perspective as the executive director of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, how you look at this energy transition, and what is your own take from what we hear today and your own work in the foundation.
Thank you very much. As a former executive director of the IEA, maybe my achievement for the climate change mitigation wasn't so good. Still, we are agonizing about how to deal with this issue, and lack of ambition in the government is still there. But when I started my job in the IEA, we promote the idea of, let's say, so-called 450 ppm scenario, which is the 2 degrees Celsius scenario of the atmospheric temperature containment. Things has been developing very much since then, and the recent IEA's World Energy Outlook tells us about the 4 revolutions in the world in energy. The first is the shale revolution in the Northwest, in North America, the US. The solar photovoltaic, the second revolution the IEA is telling us is the solar photovoltaic will be the cheapest source of electricity. I was really surprised to hear that. Solar was very expensive, wind is expensive. Without support measures like feed-in tariff, nothing happens. Still, Japanese feed-in tariff is very high, but in some country in the world, solar is very, very cheap and very prevalent. And Europe is very successful using solar and wind. So this is the very new area which Japan must be serious. And also the third revolution, which IEA says that China is very serious at greening. It's leaving air pollution, using natural gas, replacing coal, hell of the renewables. And the fourth revolution is electrification, EV, AI, digitalization, big data. This is happening by sustainable electricity. So if we all see 4 items together, the North America is pushing very hard of using conventional fossil fuel like gas and oil to promote energy dominance. That is what President Trump is trying to do. While China, as is the largest consumer of energy, is trying to use more renewable energy like solar, wind, and gas to replace coal, the green revolution, and make industrial economy as successful by digitalization. So China is taking advantage of 3 revolutions out of 4 and make the different world. Then people around the world is getting more serious about what is happening in China, reducing dependence to the fossil fuel from either US, Middle East, or Russia, and making their energy independence. So this is a very interesting world where we have to think about sustainability and energy security. If the solar is cheapest, Japan should use it as much as possible. But why not we cannot do? Still, this is a big question mark, and I'm promoting the idea of regulatory reform of power market. We have 9 regional monopolies of the utilities, and they don't want to connect each other, their grid lines, and using more renewables. So power market reform is must, but this is very difficult to see happen. So what I am promoting at this moment is using the driver of the demand side. I'm the chair of the ICEF, Innovation for Cool Earth Forum, started by Prime Minister Abe, and promoting this TCFD, the Task Force for Climate Financial Disclosure, which we have discussed substantially this morning. And with this forum, we promote that so-called, we call it cool capitalism, but try to use financial market to pressure the private sector to go more sustainable, buy more disclosures. And this kind of exercise is very successful. Japan is now have 160 signatories to the TCFD. This is the largest number in the world in just a couple of months. And we invited some company which call for renewable energy 100 to the ICEF meeting last year. Apple was the one. What Apple lady told me is that they are aiming at 100% renewables in the future, but they also ask their vendors in the supply chain to do the same. So that means if more and more companies sign to the TCFD and announcing renewable energy 100, then who will buy the electricity generated by coal? So this is the beginning in Japan for the demand side driven transformation of the energy sector. So we have to enhance this movement, and this is a way that we will make a difference. And here I have a proposal, which I made it in the Sasagawa Peace Foundation yesterday, is that TCFD is very strong climate lens of the investment.
Yes.
I want to add gender lens to it, because climate change is not gender neutral. UN Women says that the women is much more vulnerable to the effect of climate change than men. When you look at the farmers in Africa, is 90% women, so they suffer more. And fetching the water, it's a burden for girls and women if climate change getting worse. But also, women are the very important agent of change. So if they're informed well about the issues and support for change, they will vote for more pro-environment leaders. So by doing so, promoting gender equality is promoting sustainability. So I'm strongly advocating that let's combine climate lens with gender lens, and that will really strengthen the direction toward sustainability in the future. Thank you.
Very good points. Thank you very much. Driving the demand side and basically making the demand for fossil fuel obsolete is, I think, in our heads when we're thinking about the energy transition in all aspects. And driving the energy transition from both gender lens, from both in particular, is another important point from you. So very important aspect. Both of you, Anna, you a bit more, but you also have alluded to the role of cities in particular. And our next guest, Teruyuki Ono, who is at the moment the executive director of the Renewable Energy Institute, but who has been working for a number of years, I'll be careful now, for a number of years with the metropolitan city government of Tokyo. So I would guess that you have in your DNA the urban perspective. And that's going to be interesting then to see what your experience is then taking the urban perspective on questions of the global energy transition and climate change. Ono-san, please.
I will be speaking in Japanese. Thank you very much for the introduction. Yes, it is true that from 6 years ago, I came to this Renewable Energy Institute, but before that, it's no secret that for 34 years, I was working at the Tokyo Metropolitan Government. And the last 10 years or 10 to 13 years, I was involved in environmental administration. So let me talk about that since it was raised as topic. In conducting this energy transition, the role to be played by cities and the regions is very important. As somebody pointed out, a lot of population, industry, and energy consumption will be concentrated in cities. So cities will have to change. Otherwise, there's not going to be a transition. And the cities also have the power to act. In March of this year, the city of New York, emission trading introduction was decided by the city of New York. And from the time of Mayor Bloomberg, they have been stepping up on climate action, and Mayor de Blasio is also very positive about this. And in March, they have decided to introduce the cap-and-trade system. But what I want to say is that the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, from more than 10 years ago, we had actually introduced such a system that was just introduced by New York. We looked at the possibility back in 2007, and for 1 year we had a lot of discussions, including the business. And in 2008, we decided to introduce the cap and trade system, and that's been in place for about 10 years. So large businesses, about 1,300 businesses, are covered in this system. But CO2 reduction of about 26% on average has been achieved so far. So what I want to say is that Tokyo Metropolitan Government has already decided on this policy of introducing such a policy back in 2007 and had thorough discussions with NGOs and with business and realized this in 1 year time. And in 2 years' time, that was already implemented. Now, under the environmental ministry of the national government of Japan, I am on the committee to take a look at the possibility of doing carbon pricing. Now, carbon pricing studies at the national government level has been conducted for the past 20 years now. But this week, actually on Tuesday of this week, decarbonization strategy to 2050 was announced by the Japanese government. Advanced countries are now coming up with a strategy for reduction, and the Japanese government has decided on the strategy on Tuesday of this week. And if you look at the content of that, it only says that the government needs to take a further look at the possibility of carbon pricing. They have been looking at this for the past 20 years, but they still say that they need to study this further. When is it going to end? When are they going to take a decision? There's this tendency at the national government level, but local governments, mayors, governors, they have a lot of roles to play. And there are staff members to support them with insight and knowledge, working together with business NGOs. They will be able to do this more quickly than at the national level. So I would say that the roles to be played by regions and municipalities are large. Tokyo, Kyoto, Yokohama, they're saying that they will realize net zero emission in 2050. And according to the national government strategy, 1.5 target in 2050, and there are large voices heard to become carbon neutral in 2050, but that's not a commitment at the national government level. So I think there's a lot that regional levels can do.
Very much. Maybe one more question for you, Ono-san, because in the G20 context, we're mainly looking on the national levels, right? So it's the G20 countries that are representing national governments. So now there is a number of stakeholder groups. F20 is one, C20, Business 20, the legendary think tank 20 group, and a new group has emerged, which is Urban 20. Urban 20 trying to sort of raise its voice in a group where only national governments are represented. So I wonder if you would share this experience that the voice of cities, no matter from which country they are in particular, but given the importance of the city, is not really enough represented in the national decision-making processes.
As was just pointed out, there's this grouping called G20, but in the following session, U20, U20, the Tokyo Metropolitan Government organized a conference in May. Mr. Yamamoto from Special Advisor to the Government of International Affairs from the Tokyo Metropolitan Government will talk about that.
I think that the voice of cities is really to be put into the context of the national decision-making processes, and Urban 20 is definitely one aspect. Let's move on to an organization that is still relatively new, which is the International Renewable Energy Agency, that is headquartered in Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, but that has already legendary Bond Center, who is doing a lot of thinking about renewable energy development. And I'd like you, Dolph Gielen, you're heading the center, to just give us a little bit of an overview. Where are we now with the renewable energy development, and what are your perspectives in particular, what we need to do, especially in the context of the G20, because I know you are deeply involved in this.
Yeah, thank you very much, Stefan, and it's a great pleasure to be here today. We, together with 4 other institutions, we issue every year a progress report on SDG 7. And so the last edition was issued a few weeks ago. And it shows that we're making progress, but we're not making enough progress. So over the last decade almost, the share of renewables in power generation has been growing by about 0.7% per year, percentage points per year. So we're now at about 26% share of renewable power generation, in total power generation. The share of renewables in total final energy consumption has been increasing by about 0.2 percentage points per year, and we're now at about 18% renewables in total final energy consumption. So that is
18%.
18. So that is significant, but it's nowhere close to what we would need. So according to our estimates, for a reasonable chance of 1.5 degrees, we need 89% renewable power by 2050 globally, and we need about 67%, so 2/3 renewables in total final energy consumption by 2050. So that means the growth of renewables in power generation needs to double, and the overall growth of renewables in total final energy consumption needs to increase 6-fold. The renewable power, of course, wind and solar are really critical, where the total capacity needs to increase about 15-fold worldwide between now and 2050. All these renewables numbers need to be combined, as Sven Teske rightly said, with also much more ambitious energy efficiency policies. So we've seen over the last number of years about 2.4% annual improvement of the energy efficiency or the energy intensity. We need about 3.2%. So we need an increase of the effort there by at least 50%. So, on the renewable side, of course, there's always talk about generation, and generation additions are important, but we also need change on the end-use side, and there we think that a combination of more renewable power generation and electrification of end users is critical. So today, electricity accounts for about 20% of total final energy consumption, that would need to increase to almost 50%. So electromobility, heat pumps, industrial electric processes, electricity-driven processes are really critical. And they bring at the same time the opportunity to introduce more renewables through renewable power, and they increase the efficiency significantly. So that's a win-win opportunity. Now, in terms of questions we always get, as Irina, and we also got here in the G20 context, is, what about variable renewable power? Is that possible? Well, the answer is clearly, yes, it is possible. But you need to make sure that you have the right market and regulatory frameworks, as Mr. Tanaka said. You also need to make sure that the operational practices are adjusted, and you need to allow for new business models on top of the generation and on top of the grid and flexibility investments technologies that are needed to make that happen. Is it affordable? Reference case has, so business as usual would have energy investments of around $95 trillion between now and 2050. An Paris compatible scenario requires about $110 trillion. So it's about 15% more. I would say it's not a significant difference, but it's a completely different structure of the investments. Much more emphasis on efficiency and renewables, less investments in fossil fuels. And as was also said repeatedly today, we need to make sure that that happens now, or you will see a lot of stranded assets. Regarding the last point on the cities, so also for G20 this year, we have prepared a report on what is called community energy, which includes cities, which includes rural communities, but where we also included corporate sourcing as an interesting new approach for a non-national actor to have a significant impact to accelerate this energy transition. So we think that the non-state actors have to play a key role to really make all these ambitions and these numbers happen.
And with regard to the G20 process, I mean, I won't ask you now if you think that the 20 heads of state will agree on a 100% renewable energy target in a week from now. They probably won't, because we know the current situation. But my question then would go, okay, if we can't expect this leadership that we would need now for the survival of humanity, basically, if we can't expect this leadership from the heads of state at this stage, where do you think are the entry points in the G20 process, despite this, let's say, challenging political situation?
Well, the G20 agreed on a voluntary toolkit for renewable energy deployment in 2015. Then they agreed on a renewable energy action agenda in 2016. Then they agreed on a climate and energy action agenda in 2017. And they agreed on an energy transition plan in 2018. So, and I think this year we will see an innovation plan. A lot of plans, and I think it's good that a dialogue takes place at the G20 level, but I think the decisive action will not be taken at the G20 level. At the end, it will be national governments and these non-state actors that make the decisive moves to make this change. And I think what we see now with a rising political tide calling for action. And if you see this week that the temperature in New Delhi reached 48 degrees, and India has major internal migration now because of temperature change and climate effects. So I think that in the end, reality will move politics.
And which countries are actually championing at the moment? I mean, I didn't dare mentioning certain countries here, but from your perspective, from Irina, you can at least have a quick say on, you know, which are the countries that you think have embarked on an energy transition?
Well, I mean, you can read in the newspapers all these countries that now put a 2050 zero carbon target. So it's very good, very nice. Yeah. Of course, implementation is in the end what really matters. But what caught my eye is for example, Norway, where so now the Sovereign Wealth Fund, which is a significant fund, said, okay, we're gonna, and they were obliged to say to disinvest now from fossil fuels. So it's an oil and gas producing country that says, okay, we're gonna move in another direction, and I think that is a very nice example for a number of the key players that where the main challenges lie at the moment.
Great, thank you. Hank, you have
add something about?
Please, yes. I come to you, Hank, in a minute.
Sorry, I just add a small point which Dolph mentioned about renewables use in especially promotion by G20. I think Japanese government is taking hydrogen as a very serious way to use more renewables in the future, because the problem of renewable is volatility. So to take storage of electricity generated by renewables, hydrogen could be very good way as a storage methodology, together with battery. And now it's not, Japan has been promoting this idea for years, but not many countries take it serious. But now when China started really about hydrogen storage in a locality for averaging out the volatile renewables, now world is looking hydrogen as a potential. Even Saudi Aramco, who is rich in the oil reserves, are thinking serious about demand side pressure of electric vehicle, etc. The demand kind of peak of oil may come earlier. So hydrogen, so clean up, take out carbon dioxide and under the ground as enhanced oil recovery, exporting only clean hydrogen could be the way to avoid the stranded acetization of oil. So G20 may take up this hydrogen as a part of technical solution of using renewable to the full extent.
Anna, you wanted to?
It's actually also a segue to you, Hank. I wanted to come back to the numbers that you mentioned in the beginning about the global share of renewables. I think it's even more shocking or terrible if you take out unsustainable biomass. So talking about looking kind of behind the concept of renewables and actually looking at the different technologies, what you just did, we really need to look at the numbers of 18 point something % of renewables in the global energy share includes unsustainable biomass, which is used a lot in developing countries. So taking that out, it's only about 10%. So modern renewable energy, even though we all talk about it's market ready, it's there, it's cheaper, and so on and so forth, it's not a natural development that this will be implemented, because you need so much more for that. So for the 100% that Henk is probably now talking about, we still have a long way to go. And yeah, we need a lot of people for that.
Henk wasn't sure if you were referring to him, but I second this. You are a famous, I would say, ambassador for 100% renewable energy take, in particular for your own state, which is Hawaii. And I first heard about this 100% development, let's say, in Hawaii already 2 years ago or so, or probably even longer. But you've been really going through a very challenging political environment in your own constituency and in particular in your own state to really convince people about this 100% and that it's possible. And I know you've got an exciting lesson to share, please.
Yes. Yeah, so in answer to your question, Tanaka-san, I have a little situation. I decided to take myself off-grid, so my ranch is a little island. We live on solar. On sunny days, we have extra solar, and we use that solar to make hydrogen. And the hydrogen is our backup fuel. So when we have a few days of cloudy, then we use that hydrogen to make electricity, and we're waiting for somebody to bring us a hydrogen vehicle, then we can actually use that. We need a climate change deadline. You know, I'm a computer game designer by trade, and if you don't have a deadline, things never get done. So you have to say, you must finish your product by end of October, or we miss Christmas. If we don't have a deadline, we are going to miss saving this planet by any time. And I picked a date, and the date wasn't actually carefully thought out. It was a negotiation between us and the government of Hawaii. The politicians said, we'll give you 2050, and we got the children out and tried to demand 2040, and we settled in the middle. Now, who's on the other side of this negotiation? It was the electric company. They're saying, oh, it's impossible, we have all this, inertia. And, so let me tell you a bit about how we got through and past the electric company. I have a foundation called the Blue Planet Foundation, and the mission of the Blue Planet Foundation is to end the use of carbon-based fuel, not just in Hawaii, not just in America, but in the world. Unfortunately, Hawaii is only a small place, and our funding only allows us to do it in Hawaii so far. In the first 7 years or so, we tried many, many things. We had children go door to door and exchange 300,000 light bulbs. In so doing, they would have to explain the story of why to the adults in the house. Because as it turns out, adults listen to children more than they listen to each other. So we got the children, we got the junior high school students to draw on the sidewalks where high tide would be in a 1 meter rise in sea level. Waikiki is underwater. And so people had some awareness of what is coming. And so that's another reason, because we're on an island. The third thing we did was we had high school students work with neighbor islands and help people on the neighbor islands get energy saver refrigerators. Because it's very difficult for them to buy a refrigerator. They have to travel to another island, and then they have to have the refrigerator shipped, and it's very expensive at the end of that. Anyway, after we got the people on our side, and we got to the point where we thought we could actually do this, we got Hawaii to have a mandate of 100% by 2045, 100% renewable energy by 2045. Now, Hawaii is already a pretty good place. When we got our favorite president, Donald Trump, to say that we're pulling out of Paris, Hawaii said, no, we're doing Paris anyway. We're the first state in the union to say we're doing it anyway. And, Trump being in Washington, it's bad news for the country, but it's good news for the individual parts of the country. But guess what? And at the end of the day, we're the ones who are going to have to do it. It's not somebody sitting in some White House somewhere. It's the individual people, the companies, the individual people. So when we did this 100% renewable mandate, we're wondering what's the reaction from the electric company. And after a few months, they reacted. And the reaction was, we actually looked at it, and we figured out that we can do this by 2040. Where the hell were you guys? Why did it take us, who are actually on the outside, to give you a deadline, and then you finally figure it out? And we, by the way, we did a calculation. That would save ratepayers, 1.5 million of us, ratepayers, $7 billion. $7 billion. This is taxation without representation. This is money leaving the economy, and we get nothing except global warming, sea level rise, pollution out of it. So we flipped Hawaii, and within a year, California flipped. Amazing. So the domino theory actually works. And we asked them, so why did you guys pick 2045? And they said, you guys did 2045. Isn't that the date? No, it's not the date. It was a negotiation. So, okay, so California did 2045, and we've been helping 8 other states. We've already flipped Washington, Colorado, Nevada, and New Mexico. And they've all gotten to have a mandate of 100% by 2045. And so I started thinking, well, what's so good about 2045? And my son pointed out to me, by the way, Dad, 2045 is the 100th anniversary of the United Nations. Whoa, wouldn't it be amazing if we can get the whole world to agree to go 100% by 2045? Then we could celebrate the end of World War III. Because, hey, this is an existential threat. This is World War III, even though we don't realize it, but this is a bigger threat than World War II ever was. Anyway, last year I was invited to go and speak to the Interparliamentary Union. Most people don't even know who they are. 2 parliamentarians or elected officials from 178 countries, including Japan, including almost everybody except the United States, go to this place and they discuss things. And so I was the special guest that gave me a chance to speak about climate change. So after my 15-minute claim to fame, speaking to an international audience, later that day, they declared climate change to be the emergency. Oh, you have no idea how powerful I felt after that. I got everybody to declare climate change the emergency. Unfortunately, the IPU, nobody's heard of them, and they don't really have any power. If they make a decision, who cares? So I'm thinking about this. They invited me to come back, and I'm thinking, you know what? I want to do this. We want to do this, but we want to do this with the United Nations. Why not? So we should work through the United Nations and with the United Nations and get the United Nations and all the countries that belong to the United Nations to have a deadline. Because if we don't have a deadline, it just isn't going to happen. And 2050 is nice, but I bet a lot of people are going to miss 2050. So if we have that 2045 deadline, we have a little bit of a 5-year wiggle room, and I think we need at least 5 years of wiggle room. So the Blue Planet Foundation, the next step is the Blue Planet Alliance. And I'm here to invite all the other NGOs and all the rest of the people who are in this audience to join me in the fight to make climate change end by 2045, starting with renewable energy. Because that's the one, in my mind, that's the one that takes the longest because of the stranded asset issue. We can't wait another 15 years to start thinking about 2040. We have to start now. And what happened in Hawaii, by the way, is as a result of this legislation, no new fossil fuel infrastructure is being built. Without our help, the governor said no to LNG. The gas company said they wanted to spend $1 billion building in LNG infrastructure because it's a bridge. LNG is not a bridge, it's a pier. It goes nowhere. So the Alliance wants countries, states, cities, companies, foundations, and people to pledge that they're going to go 100% by 2045. We need your help. Join us, and let's end climate change.
Thanks, Hank. So targets obviously are important to drive a momentum or to develop or unleash a momentum in a particular environment. Targets for a year, but also targets just as 100%. And I should say that 100% target is also a good claim because it does not only speak about generation. if you have 100%, there will be no 100%, as we've heard from Sven this morning. There will be no 100% if we don't take an equivalent effort on relearning to use energy wisely, basically energy efficiency. So would you agree that this target, this claim of 100% is really sort of an important claim where you can gather behind your allies?
Yeah, yes, so the issue is, I think, is it on?
Yes, now
the issue is, you know, to the ordinary citizen, what does 2 degrees mean? Or what does 1.5 degrees mean? How do I, as an ordinary citizen, change my behavior and achieve that? It's hard for me to understand what that even means. I'm still arguing with people who confuse climate and weather. They think, well, today is a nice day, so where is the warming? They don't understand the difference. And so we need to have a simple target that everybody can understand. And so ending climate change, or turning it around so that at that point it starts cooling, is the important thing. Now, I wanted to address your issue about justice. So the result of us having legislation to help solar industry in Hawaii has created now as many jobs outside the electric company as inside the electric company. And if we were to get more aggressive and move towards renewables, we would have more jobs. So all of your coal miners can be working on installing solar panels or building wind infrastructure. So we did some thinking about this. In Hawaii, if we were to complete the transition to renewable energy, that would reduce energy price from, you know, and this is the electric company also. The electric company basically makes 4 cents on top of the price of oil. We are now working with the electric company and the PUC, the Public Utilities Commission, to give the electric company the incentive to go to renewables quicker by allowing them to make more profit on renewables than on fossil fuel. So they can make 5 cents on, for example, renewables. So 4 cents on top of 28 cents, which is our 32 cents per kilowatt hour electric charge. If we switch to renewable, it would be 8 cents for renewables plus 5 cents. It was 13 cents. And the electric company is making more money, and our electric cost has gone way down. That's going to cause an economic boom in Hawaii. It's going to raise salaries. It's going to lower rents. It's going to make everything work better.
Yeah. Speaking about mechanisms and legal mechanisms, Anna, I'd like you to allude a bit on the question of, I mean, like 15 years ago or so, everyone was saying feed-in tariffs is the key development for developing renewable energy. Including us, including myself, coming from a country where it was first introduced in 1990 and was really revolutionary because it first time thought the electricity grid into both directions. Yeah? Not just taking electricity off, but also feeding electricity into the grid. But we've also heard that we need big-scale renewables. And I know that there's a discussion whether, you know, quota systems are the right mechanisms or power purchase agreement or whatever. So what's the cutting edge intelligence on the best mechanisms at the moment for, on a national scale or on a regional scale, to really get out of the way of the development for renewables? Let me put it this way.
Yes, thank you. Probably none of you is surprised if I now say there is no one-fits-all solution. I still think feed-in tariffs are, or is, the policy mechanism that proved the most successful. Not necessarily because the tariff part of feed-in tariff, but because of the feed-in. And this per-case obligation, which is a key mechanism of the feed-in tariff in actually all countries and regions that have implemented it. That's the key policy mechanism that really has driven the change. It's not necessarily the money that, well, I feed my solar energy that I have on my roof into the grid. And of course, it's really helpful to get a tariff per kilowatt hour, because that allows me to pay back the investment that I made. However, the fact that there is a per case obligation actually enabled me to go to my bank and actually ask for the credit that I need. So this kind of investment security is, I think, the key policy mechanism, and whether you call it feed-in tariffs or anything else doesn't really matter. The problem with quota systems or with bidding systems is usually that there is a lot of investment needed from everyone who is taking part in the tender, but only a few, those who get the bid, can make the money. So there is a lot of money wasted, and a policy like a feed-in tariff allows everyone to participate and everyone to pay back their loans or get a revenue from it. So I think that's why looking at the regulatory framework does not really help us fighting about the name of a policy, but really looking at the policy mechanism of the elements that stand behind. Which is also why setting a target I would actually call a very important policy mechanism. Because of the reasons that you just mentioned, Hank, having a deadline, having the opportunity for concerted efforts, but also because 100% renewables actually gives a positive target. Anything about reduction is really negative. It always signals this kind of, I have to do less of anything. However, that doesn't really inspire people. So if you actually set a 100% target, you channel investments, you signal where is the goal that we want to reach. And having heard the numbers on a global scale, and we can break it down in different countries, even with high shares. I come from Germany, and we have more than 1/3 of our electricity coming from renewables. However, the downside is we still have almost 70% of the power coming from other sources, and even more if you include the heating and the transport sector. Okay. So therefore, I think target setting and this kind of investment security, like we have it in the feed-in tariff with the per case obligation, are key mechanisms that we need across the world in all countries.
Henk, short addition, please, and then Ono-san.
Yeah, so a couple of things. So in Hawaii, we passed the solar benefits, and at first it was thought that within a couple of years we were going to have 30 megawatts, which would have been 1.5% penetration. It turns out within 2 years we had 300 megawatts, and so that's 15%. And the electric company goes, no, we can't handle that much. And in fact, when I tried to put solar on my house in Honolulu, the electric company said, no, you're not connecting. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to disconnect. That's fine. But most people don't have that opportunity. The thing is, at the end of the farthest reaches of the grid weren't designed for a lot of electricity to go the other way. And so that in itself is a problem. But it can be solved if we start thinking about microgrids at the end of the line. There's two things that are going to happen. One is there's a point at which everybody starts to try to drive electric cars. And that's like doubling the number of houses, because when you buy an electric car, it's like having a second house on the same line. I've experienced this. I come home, plug in my car. In the morning, we're taking a cold shower. So there's only room, as a result, we only charge on sunny days, by the way. But the point is, when everybody starts getting electric cars, they're going to need much more electricity at the end of the line. And by making the end of the line more robust and sort of energy independent, we won't have a situation like Puerto Rico. I just came back from Puerto Rico. It's a disaster, and it's because all the electricity is generated in a few places, and when it gets cut off, it's over. All the food went bad within days in all of Puerto Rico. Yeah. And that, by having like batteries at the end and microgrids at the end of the line. We should build in that kind of resilience.
Okay. Ono-san, please.
Now, policy framework. I'd like to, well, the Japanese audience, if you read the first page of Nikkei newspaper, it talked about FIT system ending. That was a major headline story that ran on the first page of Nikkei newspaper. You might have been shocked to read that. Of course, FIT system is not for perpetuity. If the prices come down, it's going to be brought to an end. But solar power is, the price has come down sufficiently, and there is also the prospect that it will continue to come down. As for wind, I think it's still premature. So this FIT system, what to do about this in Japan has to be discussed more. But at the same time, there's another important discussion underway. People say that FIT system in Japan and the European system and other countries' system, saying that the FIT system has been dropped in other countries to adopt the auction system overseas. But there's a missing point. Those countries, electric system reform has already been completed. They already have a competitive and transparent markets in such countries, but not in Japan. In 2020, next year, there is going to be unbundling between transmission and distribution, but is this really going to be, or generation and distribution, is this going to be very fair and competitive? There's going to be a lot of intervention needed. So introduction of renewable energy in Japan, well, things that have already been completed in other OECD countries, they have already completed the electric system reform. We have to do that first before we can introduce the renewable system in Japan and to have a transition. So that's a point that I wanted to make.
Important point. Thank you, Ono-san. Unfortunately, this watch that you don't see is telling me that we have to close in 2 minutes 43, 2, 1. So we have to close this panel, unfortunately. So I'm sorry for not giving you another a chance to speak. I think we've heard excellent points here about how we can drive down the demand for the fossil fuel energy and how we can increase the demand for renewables, about the regulatory framework that we need here in Japan in particular, and about regulatory frameworks in other parts of the world, how they need to be adapted to the constituency and to the particular local conditions. And the role of targets, in particular, the significance of 100% targets to really get your people behind. Before I close, I want to ask you one question, and I please ask you to just answer it in 10 seconds. 10 seconds. And the closing question to you is, if there was one thing, one most important factor for progress for renewable energy, what would it be? What would be the one thing that you would actually change to really accelerate progress? There are many, many other aspects, but what would be the most important rate-limiting factor for progress? Who wants to start? You are nodding, so you already have an answer.
Yeah, I have the answer. One is the use of the renewables. Most important thing is the size of the market and connect it.
The
so
connectivity
is probably most important,
yes.
And that guarantee flexibility. So Masayoshi Son of SoftBank is connecting Japan to Asia. So this Asia super grid is example, probably which Europe has already achieved. It should be copied to East Asia.
Yeah. Connectivity. Anna.
Political action with new people in key positions.
New people in key positions. Okay.
私はさっきの繰り返しになりますけれども、競争。
Let me repeat. Competition, fossil fuel, nuclear, and renewable energy. There should be fair competition between these sources of power. That kind of market mechanism needed. If there is a fair environment, then renewable energy would prevail.
Dolph.
I would say deal with wrong perceptions and fake news.
Scientifically based policies, what we already discussed this day, in fact. Yeah. Hank.
I would create an international system by which countries that switch to renewables faster have a benefit, like lower taxes or more money from the World Bank.
So rewarding the pioneers, basically.
Yes.
Yeah. Excellent point. Thank you very much, gentlemen. We are really in time. It's just 10 seconds left. So thank you very much.
ありがとうございました。
Thank you very much.
拍手をまたスピーカーの方々に。
Thank you very much. With a big applause, please. Thank you very much. We will have a break, but before the break, again, it is the photo session.
But not on the stage. We hope that audience will be join us in the photo session. So フォトセッションやるんですけれども、ステージから皆さんと
A photograph with all of you in the audience. The photographer is going to be on the stage. Thank you.
Maybe we can have this. Okay.
What do you want to have?
Lenin. Aria.
はい、すみません。皆さん、お座席にお付きになったままお待ちください。今、ステージの上から皆さんを含めてお写真の方を撮らせていただきます。ちょっと準備する間、お待ちください。
はい。Have a seat. Have a seat. Yes.
So photo will be kind of like this.
あ、いいですね。全然いい。あ、でもちょっと変かな。写真で残っちゃうもの。スピーカーの人がいた方がいいですね。
じゃあこれでだいたい。Pretty much everybody. In the center.
ここ誰が座る？
あ、誰か座ってください。はい、入ります。OK。Like how far? 大丈夫？はい、では今こちらから撮影しますので、手振っていただいても構いませんので、wave your hand。大丈夫ですか？はい。Okay, one more please。もう一枚撮ります。
なんか言ってくれないとあれがない。せーのとか、ワンツースリーとか、チーズとか。
じゃあ日本スタイルで、we say cheese in Japanese. So if I say cheese, please wave everybody。じゃあ皆さん。じゃあそれではチーズチーズ Thank you very much ありがとうございました。